The Hebrew scriptures say that from the midst of their captivity in Egypt, the Israelite people began a journey that would change everything. They packed up their belongings, they donned their traveling cloaks, and they crossed out of the fertile land of Egypt where they were never free, and out into the barren desert where their freedom was very nearly the only thing they had. They walked from captivity into desolation, from the abundance of other people's table to starvation on the way to their own home. And even when their burdens were the greatest, when they would have given almost anything for water to drink or food to eat, they carried with them one thing that they never did put down. Specifically, the scriptures say that those ancient refugees in the desert places carried with them the bones of their ancestors. And not just any ancestors, but the bones of the ones whose courage lived in their veins, whose perseverance made them unafraid in the most important times. The ancient stories tell us that at least one ancestor whose bones they never put down through all those 40 years was Joseph. Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, who rose from the betrayal of his brothers to take a place among the most powerful men in Egypt. The story says that when the ancestor Joseph, yes, the one of the multicolored coat, when the ancestor Joseph was 110 years old, he lay dying in a foreign land in Egypt, knowing that his people's journey would take them far from that place. And so before he went, at 110 years old, this ancestor asked one solemn oath of his people. "Carry me with you," he said. "Surely you must carry my bones with you from here to the place toward which you are walking." And so they did just that. They schlepped those bones across a continent. They carried them on their backs over desert sands. They stood up day after day to bear those burdens and never dared put them down until finally they laid their ancestor Joseph down in the soil of the promised land on the other side of the desert, and he rested in the place where his people were finally free. I am sure, over 40 years of a journey, that they dropped a great many things in the sand along the way. On any journey that matters, you have to drop a great many things along the way, because you can only make it so far in the desert with the burden of all your stuff. Even grandma's rolling pin gets tossed in the shifting sand when you've got no dough to knead and no food to eat. The burdens the people chose to carry must have changed over those 40 years. There must have been a trail of things scattered across the Sinai as they left the unnecessary burdens that they needed behind. But not those bones. Those bones they took along with them through all of the desert places. Until finally they came home, they carried the memory of his death with them, the memory of his life. They carried the tragedies and the traumas of his story with them. And though his body had weight, it was to them a weight worth carrying, because wielding it relieved a greater burden. Those few pounds of bone and dust relieved the people's burden of being alone in a strange place, without family or memories or roots or security, without ancestry or a story or a song all their own. The weight of those bones was a reminder of the people's heritage and of their legacy, of first things, of origin stories, of beginnings. And when the Israelites in the desert had no home, no place, no safety or security or even enough food, in absence of those things, still they had those dry bones as a kind of ballast to hold them to earth. Still they carried their ancestors along with them. In our own lives and in our life together, we are asked to walk into desert places. We are asked to make our way over uncertain terrain with uncertain outcomes toward destinations that sometimes seem so distant they will always recede like a horizon before us. The journey of a life, after all, is not all straight lines walked over fertile fields. It is twisty, sometimes barren, sometimes altogether uncertain, and more than a little frightening. We must be discerning about the burdens we choose to carry with us over such terrain. Burdens carried over emotional, spiritual, even literal desert places along our journeys. And we must be careful what inheritance we choose to keep on shouldering from those who went before us. Because the legacy of all that we inherit, it can be complicated after all. Beautiful, broken, heavy. Sometimes, but not always, worth carrying. A legacy and the weight of it is, complicated. We do not recreate our legacy, after all, with every generation. We do not shoulder entirely new burdens and new gifts with each passing lifetime. As James Baldwin put it, history is not the past. It is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. My sister got my grandmother's hands. From the McDonald side of the family, her hands are soft and smooth and white. I got my mother's hands, gristly and strong and prone to arthritis already. And it is biology and ancestry and the chain of DNA writing itself in splendid and unpredictable ways that gives us these gifts we have, neither better than the other, just different. It is biology and ancestry and blood, but not all of our history is written in our biology. More often, the things we carry with us from generation to generation are passed on in our habits, in our ways of being, in the practices among our people over the span of decades that start to look like culture. We carry with us not just the living biological legacy of our mother's hands or our grandmother's hands or our father's aching knees, but the living legacy of our people's experiences, both the triumphs that shape the spirit and the trauma that scars the soul. Yes, we too are shaped by the shaking hands and the fears of those who went before us. We carry these generational experiences of triumph and trauma not just in our thinking brains, but in our bodies, on our own backs, in the bunched up anxious muscles of a frightened moment, in the urge to fight or to flee when we feel unsafe because people in the generations before us felt unsafe too and found a way to survive and passed those hard-won lessons on to us. We carry these generational experiences just as surely as we carry our DNA. And like the ancient Israelites, we too must choose which aspects of our inheritance to scatter behind us in the sand of our journey and which to bear up on our shoulders to the next generation. I recently had occasion to spend a few days among colleagues learning with the renowned trauma therapist Resmaa Menakem, who defines the deepest core of trauma as anything at all that comes to us too much, too fast, and too soon. This too muchness comes at us in this world in a number of ways. And even when nothing at all about the traumatic experience feels predictable or normal or will ever be remotely okay, the fact is that our bodies respond to it in awfully predictable ways. Fight, flight, or freeze are the embedded responses to trauma in our bodies. We find them, we grab them, we hold on to these responses when the too muchness demands of us an immediate response. They get us through the dark night when what we need most of all is survival. Like reflexes, these responses see us through. And yet, as Resmaa writes, these immediate and visceral bodily responses to the risk of the world around us, they can become habits among our people. They can become ways of shaping the world that shape our experience of absolutely everything. In his words, as the years and decades passed, reflexive traumatic responses can lose context. A person might forget something happened to him or her and internalize those trauma responses. When this same strategy gets internalized and passed down over generation and generation in a particular group, it can start to look like culture. Therapists, he says, call this traumatic retention, and it passes from generation to generation. In this way, trauma can pass from person to person, from family member to family member, from year to year, the way we respond when we are frightened, fight, flight, or fear, some combination thereof unique to our own circumstance and our own story. It is passed down like a legacy, like a song, like a habit of the heart from generation to generation, and we bear these habits of the heart forward with us. We bear this tradition forward on our backs, artifacts of a previous generation's trauma into all that will come after us. Resma writes that unhealed trauma acts like a rock thrown into a pond. It causes ripples that move outward, affecting many other bodies over time. And the things we carry along with us, our suffering and that of our ancestors before us, the things we carry with us shape our choices in some ways, in ways that sometimes constrain our power to live, to thrive, to feel. Like Joseph's bones. Sometimes the weight of our ancestors is ballast in an uncertain world. Sometimes the weight we carry from those who came before us is the sum total of their courage, their resilience, their survival, the hope that saw them through. And sometimes their trauma and their fear comes down to us without contexts. And that fear turns into hatred, and that hatred manifests itself as violence, a violence that tears the world apart over and over and over again. There are some burdens we cannot carry on to the next generation. There are some traumas we must not pass on unexamined to those who come after us. There are some things that must be scattered in the sands behind us as we move forward on the journey of our lives, because cycles can be broken and habits can be shifted. Our ancestors passed down to us the living legacy of every single thing they did to survive. They passed down to us the fears and the fights and the fleeing that got them through. Yes, and sometimes those burdens of the generations are ones we have to face down so that we can put them down, if only so that we have the strength to shoulder the rest of the legacy that is also ours to bear, the gentle weight we would gladly schlep across a desert. Into our desert places, we carry both the fear and the hope of the ancestors who made a place for us. We carry one another. We carry some faith in the human condition. We carry laughter and music and dreams of a better world, and some comprehending sense that there is such a place as home when all the journeying is done. We carry the hope that if we keep on schlepping, we may find ourselves there once again in the end, emerging from the desert places with new burdens and new gifts, ready to move forward into the world after the long march is done. What do you carry with you into the desert places? What reminds you who you are in the toughest times? What gives you hope when you are far from home? Hold it to you. Bear it up on your own back. Keep it close. And may those, the precious bones of your ancestors, evidence of their courage, find their resting place in the land of your foremothers, after all of your own journeying is finally done.